Well, welcome. I'm Paul Alexander, the Missioner for Development and Financial Stewardship with the Episcopal Church in Colorado, and greetings for our fourth seminar in this series. And we're again partnering with Church Development and very pleased to have their partnership on this series, and they're helping provide the technology. So we also have Larry with us in the background, keeping us safe and sound. So we have our host today, or our co-presenter. I'm really pleased to have Mike Green with us. Mike is with the Denver Foundation, but was also really one of the founding faculty for the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, and has been really a part of the whole ABCD community from the early days. Those of you who may know about ABCD with John McKnight, and he's worked all around the Episcopal Church. He's worked in 815 at the national office and with different dioceses, especially Michigan, really working on aspects of ABCD and mutual ministry, and we're really pleased to have him with us. So good to have you here, Mike.
Thank you.
Just a little bit here, just as always, if you have questions as we proceed, there's a little button at the bottom of your page. You can click on the Q&A and we'll try and answer all your questions. So we hope to make this as interactive as possible. But let's start with a prayer just to get us centered in the presence of God and each other. Abundant God, you made us in your image and breathed in us a spirit of generosity that is both gift and response. Move us, we pray, to give as we have received abundantly, generously and joyfully, that our common ministry may ever bear witness to your unfailing grace. In the name of the three in whom we are one. Amen. So our hopes for today, and really for the long term for each of our parishes and our lives, is to begin to see stewardship as a way of being, this discipline that's practiced all throughout the year, and to have this engaged stewardship model that allows for active participation of all members of the parish, and also extend the boundaries of the parish into the community. So there's this seamless barrier, not barrier, but this really fluid interaction between parish and community and parish. And also to shift our sense to an asset-based mutual ministry in which we see the abundant gifts that are around us. And finally, to understand the role of church as anchor, and we'll speak more of that as we go forward. So our agenda, we'll talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits of engaging in year-round stewardship. That's relationship to invite, welcome, and connect. A little bit about the seasons of stewardship, but most of our time will be focused on really building this engaged church and the roots within the Episcopal Church, and focusing with Mike here on asset-based community development, and then looking at the church as anchor, and then letting you know about some upcoming opportunities before us. So what are some of the benefits of engaged stewardship? Well, probably most importantly, it creates a sense of shared mission, vision, and engagement within the parish community through a process of really deep listening. And with that shared vision, that's where the excitement comes in. That was where people feel like they're part of a community, that they're working together and working as one. And that connectedness, of course, will lead to increased potential for people to give not only time, but their financial resources to this shared mission and shared community. It also really enhances the interconnectedness of the parish with the surrounding community, and allows for young people, especially the younger generation, who aren't really excited about sitting necessarily in the pews and listening, but want to be engaged in this vibrant ministry of the church and active participation with the ministry that reaches out. That's where their excitement comes in, and that's how we will engage this next generation, because they want to find meaning in action. It also enhances the connection to the larger church, that we can work together just beyond our silos as parishes, but work together more fully and effectively as one body in Christ. It also allows us to have greater impact in areas of social and economic justice. And it also creates opportunities for us to purchase things together, to hire and collaborate together, which ultimately could lead to increased money and expenses, but also really maximizing our mission impact. I just wanted to say a little bit about there's been a lot of energy around the church with Mary Palmer's Invite, Welcome, and Connect effort. And we had a wonderful seminar, about 80 parishes or 80 people participated. And it's all about this sense of, this radical hospitality and this sense of really engaging our parishioners in the community and just really welcoming. And so this is a natural outgrowth and a really complementary this. And without that, we really can't have year-round stewardship. And we share with these 4 values that are part of our Invite, Welcome, Connect, this deep prayerful depth that we start with in a place of prayer. There's also intentionality, that we have a systematic way of doing, and that's one of the powerful things about ABCD, is that this very systematic, but it's also open and fluid and responsive. So we share that with Invite, Welcome, Connect. It's also highly relationship. It's also all about building relationships and engaging with our fellow human beings and with all of creation. And finally, we're accountable to each other, that this is not just something that's loose, but that we're mutually accountable to our sense of community and to our work for creation and social justice. So we share something very strong with Invite, Welcome, and Connect, and hope to move forward with that as well. Just want to share with you one parish that has really done, I think, a great job of sharing these opportunities. It's St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Longmont here in Colorado. And will there be a link to do if you go to your chat area? We'll have links of all these different sites, but they've created an amazing parish ministries guide where there's 50 different opportunities, and that's what we want to be able to do, is to say there's so many ways to share your gifts, and every individual has a gift that they can share, and we just need to open up and listen to what those gifts are. So I encourage you to go and take a look at that ministries guide that St. Stephen's has. So when we talk about year-round engaged stewardship, one maybe way to look at it is to think of seasons of stewardship. Here in the Episcopal Church, we have our church seasons, and so to be able to tie stewardship to the different seasons and maybe reflect differently during each of those seasons. So for example, Lent is a time of self-examination, a time to really go inward and think about our own role and our own relationship to Christ and each other. So part of stewardship is about self-care and creating places for self-awareness and personal discernment, especially, well, around everything, but especially around life and family and vocation and, yes, money. How do we relate to money? How do we, what is our own personal story around, money and our own sense of debt and our fears around money and our fears around resources and our fears around using our gifts. So Lent is a good time to begin to really think about this stewardship of self. Then there's Epiphany and Christ being manifest into the world, a light to the world. And it might be a good time to really engage in what is our ministry as community? How are we going to take this light of Christ, this deep sense of our gospel life out into the world, and not only out into the world, but deep listening and sharing in the world, so that we become a deep sense of community. And then, of course, there's that long season of ordinary time, but Advent, when we feel Christ coming and fulfilling of the promise, and this desire to share our own gifts, just like God gave the gift of His Son to all of us, and it's our time to give of our own resources, our own lives, and our own gifts, and our own money out into the world, just like God showed us. And then, of course, there's the time of Easter and Pentecost, this sense of death and resurrection, to find meaning at the end of life, and to be able to share with people how they can do their legacy work. That's also an important part. What is the legacy that we want to give? And Easter and Pentecost is a great time for that. So if you think about year-round stewardship, really integrate in your own sense of what are these seasons that we have as an Episcopal Church and as a church as we really go forward. One diocese that's done an excellent job of this is the Episcopal Diocese of West Texas. I encourage you to go with that. They have something for every month of the year, and each month they go through this circle that you see on the screen there. What is our stewardship around God's creation, around our own self-stewardship and spiritual growth? What's our ministry to the world, and what ministry do we want to spotlight this particular month? How can we move outside of ourselves and into the world and meet the world? And then, what is our own financial health, both as a community, as an individual? So they've done an amazing job, and I really encourage you to go to that website at West Texas. So we really want to focus today on this sense of engaged church. And this has been so fundamental within the Episcopal Church, especially in the last 5 years. In the General Convention in 2015, a resolution about affirming our relationships and our social ministry justice. And it's called out especially that we should be using ABCD, asset-based community development, within our church and build community partnerships. And they use the term mutually affirming relationships to be with the poor. And that's really what we want to do when we talk about engaged scholarship, engaged church, is these mutually affirming relationships. And Mike will talk a lot more about that. It's really all about relationships. And there's a wonderful partnership between the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal Relief and Development Group that came out around called Call to Transformation, that again builds on this ABCD engaged relationship piece that talks about building a foundation, planning, discerning, and taking action. And then the other piece that's been so much a part of the Episcopal Church is this term mutual ministry that was very strong even before the 60s, but really took on and is a part of a lot of dioceses, especially Nevada and Michigan. That tries to move us from the sense of clericalism, where the minister is all, and then inching us a little bit to more of a team ministry where the minister is still at the focus, but that there's kind of this core group. But we really want to, and those are important. I mean, there's clearly an important role for the minister and the rector, but ultimately we want to be in this place of mutual ministry, which really every person is an active participant. And Mike, you want to tell us a little bit about your experience with mutual ministry?
I worked for 2 or 3 years. I went maybe 4 times a year to northern Michigan, to the Diocese of Northern Michigan. And it was a very powerful, unique ABCD story of asset building. And I think one thing I would say is that ABCD, or asset-based community development, came from stories. It was not a theory that was made up in a university. It was listening to lots of stories and making communities strong all over North America, and then ultimately all over the world. And then asking ourselves what was in common to all these stories. And it was like lots of people described, you could use as an example, what was their favorite way to make a chocolate cake. But there might be thousands of recipes around the world, and all good, but they would all have chocolate, flour, egg, sugar in them. So what we were looking for, if you distilled it, boiled it down, what was fundamental about communities rebuilding, getting strong, whether it's a little rural place or the most challenged urban neighborhood. And mutual ministry in Northern Michigan was a great, great story and experience. And I will always remember being there. And the context, which some of you I'm sure know, is that their challenge was, how do you have a functioning diocese given that you have very, very small congregations, maybe some of them 20, 30 members, and can't possibly afford to have a clergy member. So how do you minister together to the congregations? What's the role of clergy and staff? And so what they really developed was this idea that everybody is engaged in ministry, and really the clergy function more like an itinerant community organizer. And that's my background, community organizing. But really the test of an organizer is, what do you get other people to do? Through your work, do you activate others? Do you animate others? And that was really the way they were thinking about the role of clergy, is they were activating leadership and they were building more and more relationships. And so it's a wonderful example of the core of ABCD.
So tell us more about ABCD.
So there are three things, and they're very much embodied in mutual ministry. And really in all these stories, thousands of stories have three elements in common. The flour, eggs, and sugar are that people pay more attention to what they do have rather than to what they don't have, the assets. And most help, if you think about it, including seminaries, the way help operates conventionally through congregations, human services, schools, local government, is not asset focused but needs based, right? That if you identify the need, you assess what you think people need, and then you try to help them, is the basic direction. And a lot of times it doesn't work very well. So we found repeatedly, and ultimately all over the world, is when people began with what they have rather than what they don't have, the glass half full rather than glass half empty, they got much better results. And then the second thing is that the power to get things done is the more and more people work together, particularly across differences, that the power really is in relationships. So the more people are intentionally building relationships and building a wider and wider circle of common interest, then the more ability you have to achieve good outcomes. A word that people used in mutual ministry in northern Michigan is that we're one making, that we're becoming in one, in ever increasing circles of people who are acting as one related community. And then the third characteristic is what we call inside out. And most help comes from the outside in. Somebody who's considered an expert decides what people should do and tries to convince them of it. Whereas what works much better is if people own the problem and get to decide what to do about it. And then helpful outsiders support them to do that. There's a saying in the disabilities world that I think describes it very well: not about me, without me. That if it's about young people's problems, then young people need to be in the middle of the conversation about what to do.
Great.
The basic assets, and one of the key activities of ABCD is asset mapping, and that'd be something that later would be on the list of next step. We could help any congregation, even as short as one evening, do an asset mapping process. And people always find they have more than they think they have. And that's one of the reasons that ABCD's been, I think, the most popular community development approach, period, there is that people often are disheartened by their neediness. But when they start looking for what they have, put on a different pair of glasses, you see what you're looking for. If all you see is what you don't have, that's what you find. If you're looking for what you do have, it's a very different picture. And the basic categories are individuals, most importantly, with gifts, voluntary associations, of which congregations are one of the most important, and nonprofits, all the helping organizations, government, widely speaking, from libraries to schools to city, county, federal government, businesses, for-profit profit institutions. Then how does the local economy function? Is it dependent on outside resources? Do people buy and sell from each other? And then the physical world, often like one of the things that it's my understanding very much happening in the Episcopal Diocese of Colorado and other denominations too, is just making an asset inventory of available space that's not being used that could in some way create either temporary or permanent affordable housing for people, right? And so that's been done in lots of areas to consider vacant land not a problem, but a resource, for example. And that's the way ABCD is very often looking at what you have, but in a different way. And the basic process is find the assets, then mobilize them, and then get them more connected. But the last comment I would make about this slide is there are two really invisible assets that are the rocket fuel, that not much will happen unless you're really paying attention to getting these two assets in motion. And that are the network of relationships among people. Like if you think of a congregation of 150 people, it's really more like 15,000 people if you think of the relationship networks of those 150 people. And if you imagine that we really were intentionally activating that network, say for opportunities for young people, the power of it is amazing. If you think of 100 Episcopal congregations in Colorado, just imagine how many relationship connections there are among 100 congregations, or thousands and thousands of possibilities through trustworthy relations that people already have. The other thing is, what really moves the world is what people care about enough to act, not have an opinion that somebody will act on, but that I myself will act on. And so it's really important to listen for the motivation to act, so that care and relationship are the two invisible assets.
Great. All right.
And how you would discover what people care about. In a way, the most fundamental act of community building are conversations. If you're not having conversations, you're not doing it, I would say, pretty much is a bottom line. So the more that you're engaged in meaningful conversations, the more likely people are to have good things happen. And fundamentally, in a really simple way, whatever the model or approach of community building or community organizing, whatever the purpose of it, it's fundamentally about having in-person conversations, one-to-one in living rooms, pew conversations, but small, intimate conversations where people discover what they care about, where people get more connected, and where people then take some kind of action out of that individual interest becoming more a common interest, and then being moved to act. So it unites people, motivates people, and then leads to powerful action. So that's really the center.
Are there any conversations that are too hard? I think, about money or racism, or how do you even begin that kind of
I think the way, again, the idea of inside out, you would begin, that's a great question. And in my mind, you begin where people are, not where you wish they were. So if they want to talk about recreation, that's what you talk about. I mean, you pay attention to where people's energy is. Like that would be a real principle of ABCD, is following the energy, or I'd say of any organizing. And then one thing leads to another thing. If people talk about, how could we have more recreational opportunities for families? Then as they talk to each other and get to know each other, particularly across their differences, then they might discover that they're very concerned, let's say, about safety of their children, or they're very concerned about how law enforcement is different for young black teenagers than white teenagers. And now some white parents also are in relationship with black parents around safety. And so they have a different kind of connection that would lead to a different kind of issue, what might be a next issue. So I think that's the way it works. It's an organic kind of process of leadership development. People have a deeper analysis, but they start where, you have to start where people are, would be my thought.
Good advice, yeah.
And this is just back to the point about recognizing about the inside out, a simple slide that any congregation might make this very simple analysis. You might ask yourself, how do we basically help people? And most help is like that left side, that left column, where we, if we had a need, literacy, we wanted people to read better, then we would assess what the best solution is, right? We might ask the local university or something, and they say tutoring. Then we would offer tutoring, and we'd try to get people to use tutoring and to volunteer to do tutoring. But it assumes that people are motivated to tutor and receive tutoring. So it might work or it might not work. But a much more powerful way would be to start with what people want, what they think would help young people, let's say, or adults or both, read better. And there may be hundreds of different things you could do besides tutoring. You could have reading groups, you could have involved libraries, and on and on. I was once with a group who brainstormed well over 100 things to do in about 45 minutes. And but the point is, if you start by asking people themselves, what would they want to do about better reading, more literacy, then you're going to find something that they're motivated to act on, that they're, and then you're on the path to mobilizing assets and to people acting. To really at the heart of ABCD is citizenship, not in the legal status sense, but in something more fundamental, back to the Greeks and Romans. Like in Greek or Latin, a citizen is someone who acts in the company of others. And that's what we're trying to encourage, that kind of leadership. And mutual ministry is an Episcopal example. It's exactly that, right? It's like, how do we minister, all of us, to each other? How do we become one?
Wow, okay.
A last thing that in terms of just the framework that I think is really important is when you talk about radical generosity or radical hospitality around every congregation, in every community. There are strangers in our midst. There are people who are invisible by the labels they've been given. There are people with disabilities, mental illness, who are never get out of their home because of physical illness or a psychiatric diagnosis. There are kids who are in foster home. There are people who are incarcerated. There are all different ways that every congregation of 100 people has like 100 people connected to those members who are invisible and not participating in community life. So one very powerful thing is to do a kind of stranger inventory. And it goes right to the roots of Judeo-Christian tradition, back to Abraham, and the idea of welcoming the stranger is most fundamental to ABCD. And the scriptural basis for ABCD is really John 15. We're called to be friends, not servants. But there is a whole practice which we could share, what our experience has been, a very good and simple practice for congregations about welcoming people from the edge into the community center, building a bridge by identifying what people's gifts are, their dreams, and then connecting them, plugging them in to be defined more as a contributing member rather than a recipient needing help on the edge. I think about the Bible about it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I think how people generally think of that, it's good, to be generous. But if you think of it in a more literal way, the blessing is getting to give. And a lot of times people who get labeled, like homeless, for an example, are considered people who have nothing to offer, just people who are needy, not people who are needed. And so the transformation is to help people be seen by themselves and others and have a pathway to move from client to contributor. And that's, as much as any single thing, the heart of ABCD is to get everybody in on the blessing.
Wow, that's powerful. So we wanted to share just a few examples of this, that both within Colorado and around the country. One great example is St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where Reverend Melanie Mullen, who's currently the Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care for the National Church, was called by Bishop Curry there, was part of this downtown missioner program that St. Paul's, that's in the bottom of Richmond, Virginia, decided that they would have a missioner for downtown. And I love their language here that said that the church nudges members out into the community. And, we don't have to force them out, or force our membership out, or force ourselves out. It's about gently nudging ourselves out into the surrounding community to really learn and practice what it means to be a neighbor. And that's a very, very powerful piece. And St. Paul's, by doing that, really found themselves as being this anchor and this force within the local community, working with businesses and everywhere in downtown Denver as a life force, a really economic and social and spiritual force within downtown Richmond. And these are the questions that they ask, and these are from St. Paul's, and they encourage us to do that. So, for example, the first question is, what do you need or want that we could provide? Okay, not thinking about it themselves, but asking that question. And it's this sense of, we often say, how we're so desperate to bring in new members, and how are we going to grow our churches? Well, the way to do that is to take our memberships and our parishioners and ourselves out into the world, not to worry about bringing new members in, but to take ourselves out into the world as Christ has really mandated and called us to do. And it's this shift, this inside-out shift that Mike talked about, rather than how we bring new members. Well, let's just go out and be new members into the community. So ask yourselves, what is our form of neighboring? What does our art of neighboring look like in your particular context? It's going to be different here for the cathedral than it is for St. Stephen's in Longmont, or anywhere around Colorado. And then how do you understand the concerns of the community? What systems do you have in place to very diligently and deliberately find out what the wants in the community is about? Mike, tell us about Broadway United Methodist. You've worked with them.
Yeah, Broadway. Well, Mike Mather is the pastor there and a close friend, and I worked there for several years. I went and helped Broadway figure out their path forward. And Broadway, like many Protestant church, many years ago, had over 1,000 members, and then it's in Center City, Indianapolis. As more and more white Methodists moved out of the center city, their membership went way down, and people of color were not joining. And so Broadway, this huge church, physically a huge church, was on the edge of ruin. And Mike had been there very young, when he was in seminary, and so he had a heart connection to Broadway, and they offered him to be the pastor, and he came in, and it's been very successful. They have at renewing Broadway, but fundamentally what they did is they became a relationship building congregation, not a service delivery congregation. They were in a very quote unquote needy neighborhood, but they focused on what did people have, not what did they not have. Like the title of Mike's book, which is coming out in 2 weeks, is Having Nothing, Possessing Everything. They focused on the glass half full, and they'd had food banks and lots of programs, and not to say there's not a need for food banks, but they decided to put their energy not into having a food bank, but into having dinners. So they did the art of neighboring, like the other example that Paul mentioned, intensively. So the neighborhood and the congregation more and more became one. And there was a kind of energy out of the relationships and excitement and new things that were happening that attracted people. Now it is a really thriving congregation, lots of different people from around Indianapolis. And I contacted Mike this morning and said, what would you say that you think is important to mention about the Broadway experience in this webinar? And he said there are two things that I think is really important. That it's not enough to have the conviction that all people have gifts. You have to have a relentless kind of determination to focus on, to not let anybody off the hook, that everybody's gifts are valuable and need to be given, that somebody might be homeless or somebody might have just gotten out of incarceration, but that doesn't mean, or somebody's actively on one level using drugs, but they're more to the story than that. And just be determined to identify what they have to offer the world around them. And particularly people you normally think of as serving, to recognize that they are not needy recipients only, they're also contributors. And that's the heart of Broadway, is that all people have gifts. The other thing he said this morning is that to remind people to have as much fun as is humanly possible. And in everything they do, they try to, one of the characteristics is it a situation that will offer mutual delight? Can we, however serious the undertaking, can we approach it in such a way that there is joy somewhere in it? So that would be Broadway.
One of the other things that intrigues me about Broadway is early on they created this position called roving listener, right? That went out into the community and both internally and externally and listened. Right. And
well, listening and the roving listener Dion is still there, and he goes around teaching people about it. But fundamentally, just that learning conversations and listening became how they do everything. They're constantly having conversations. Like I was there once, and Diamond, the roving listener, was asked, so how do you build community? And he said, you ask people how they want to build community. And then somebody said, well, what else do you do? He said, keep asking. And then they said, well, there must be something else. And he said, never stop asking. And that's really the heart of it. And I would say not just for Broadway, but anywhere. If you're not having meaningful conversations, not much is going to happen. A survey won't do it. It's got to be for real in-person conversations.
The other powerful thing is there's this group internally called, I guess, animators of the spirit that are animated by the spirit and animated by these conversations, and they are very flexible and kind of move into action based on the movement of the spirit and the.
It's sort of funny. I mean, I've been in not just congregations, but we've all been in organizations where there'll be the Mike committee, and it's been there 20 years. The only person interested in it anymore is Mike, right? But nobody knows how to say goodbye to it, how to, to say goodbye and let it go away. So there's all these useless committees, right? So at Broadway, there are no standing committees except for finance. Everything else arises, does something, and then they celebrate it and say goodbye to it. And the criteria, there have to be 3 or more people who themselves will work on it. There has to be identified energy, this kind of animated energy. And then they are authorized to do something. But from the beginning, there's an understanding that once they've done that something, then it'll be celebrated and it'll go away. And people go on to the next thing.
Celebration is important. So we wanted to share just briefly, we're about at the end of our time here, but there's some wonderful things going around the diocese. Mike, can you share just a little bit about Metric Caring? Because I know, they're shifting right now and doing some wonderful things. So just briefly.
Well, I mean, they're a Jubilee ministry, and I work with them pretty closely. And I'd say they had a long and wonderful history of having more what you might call a charity orientation, that their focus was providing food to hungry people, which is a very worthwhile purpose. But now what they're trying to do in this next stage of their life as an organization is continue to provide food, but it be a context to really build that bridge for people to transform their life as a family or an individual. So they're really trying to change their whole culture to be more in the spirit of what we're talking about with ABCD, and more relationship-driven, asset-focused, more led by the participants in their program. That, I mean, for example, they don't do any kind of decision-making from board to what to have for lunch that participants in the programs aren't in the middle of it.
So we need to do that in our parishes and externally.
Well, that would be where a lot of energy would be found. Yeah.
So just some other examples, St. Stephen's in Longmont, in cooperation with other folks, have created this common cathedral, which is basically taking the Eucharist into the homeless community, working in the homeless community. The homeless actively participate in the Eucharist outside rather than bringing people in. They move the Eucharist and the core focus of the church right there out in this great engaged participation with the homeless. Of course, there's some wonderful example here, right here with doing what Mike said, that the cathedral had this piece of property. There was a parking lot, and they analyzed both this asset that they had, which was land right here in downtown Capitol Hill, and they saw the need and the want of the community, which was housing, low-income housing, moving the homeless into housing and for the elderly, and they created, in partnership with the St. Francis Jubilee Ministry, these great apartments here at Cathedral Square. St. Bridget's in Frederick is doing something very, very similar with Bridget's Village in partnership that will be coming online fairly soon. And they also created Bridget's Bounty. They saw a piece of part of their property and said, wow, this would be great for gardens and for being able to have people create their own gardens, but also then garden and take this out into the community for food. Another great example is Holy Comforter. One of their parishioners was looking at their particular gifts, and their particular gifts was going all around the country creating farmers markets and setting up farmers markets. And so there was this parishioner with the gift of a farmer's knowing about farmers markets, looked at their parking lot, and there's this great expanse that they had, and said, what about if we created a farmer's market? And so they used this gift of looking at the space that they had, seeing the gift of this parishioner that knew all about creating farmers markets, seeing the need and the want in the community, weaving those together into this just a really successful Broomfield Farmers Market. Another, Grace and St. Stephen's has a wonderful program called Jazz in the Garden that just celebrates this thing of a season of joy in the end of the summer, where people come in and listen to jazz and drink beer and just get a taste of the church as a place of joy. Another parish here, St. Peter and St. Mary, also looked at their lot and said, there is no dog park here. There's a really hunger for just having a dog park. And so they created this Baker Dog Park right there in their parking lot. It's a wonderful place that people and neighbors can come and bring their dogs and share community. And so there's these wonderful examples, and of course many use Ashes to Go too, which is again taking Ash Wednesday ashes out into the community. So the last thing we wanted to leave you with is just this concept of the anchor church, just to remember that this parish, in the old days used to be this fundamental economic and social and cultural force within the community. We can still be that. And so to remember that we are, in a sense, geographic anchors. And to think of our parishioners of, just not about gifts that they can give to the community, but encourage them to, if they're human resource person, to hire locally, to do things and to associate differently. So to really think of ourselves as this major component, just like the church in Richmond did, that here we are in downtown or in rural Colorado that has this capacity to look at spiritual transformation, but also economic development, community building, education. And we as a church can join together and do joint ministries together, and to purchase jointly, to hire jointly, and to do collective action jointly as not only individual parishes, but as this collective power, geographic power here in Colorado that really impacts the economy and the community and education and the health, safety, and environment. We need to begin again to think of ourselves as members and anchors in this community, both spiritually and physically and economically. And we'll be talking more about that. So just lastly, how do we move forward on this? Well, one of the things that we're going to help provide here is, because we've listened, and to try and practice what we're talking about, is to support this invite, welcome, connect movement within the parish and within the diocese, to talk about learning communities. Mike and Anthony Suggs, and we'll talk about that in a second. Anthony's our missionary for advocacy and social justice. We'll be creating these ABCD practice and training sessions, and also coaching for your individual parish. We'll begin to build these anchor connections and this network among us for mutual purchasing and collective action, so that we can really have a bigger impact. There's the potential for, there's certainly website resources, and there's also some potential partnership between the Office of Bishop and the Colorado Episcopal Foundation around the right use of resources. And Mike, just really briefly, can you tell us about this great resource at the Denver Foundation for those of you in the Denver metro area, these neighborhood?
Well, for the anybody in the 7-county metro area is eligible to, any 3 people, to apply for a grant for action that they will take for better community. And oftentimes these grants go to congregations for up to $5,000 to help support your work, not to pay for labor. It could, for the idea is that it would be voluntary work of congregation members mainly, but you might need, depending on what the project is, some consultation, some materials. You might even need some time of a staff person of some kind to support the work that you would be taking. But the bottom line is 3 or more people can apply for it, and it's a pretty quick turnaround. And the idea is it's to seed civic action.
It's great, sort of the Holy Trinity.
Yeah, so it would be very available to people.
Well, we just wanted to thank you so much, Mike, for being with us today, and looking forward to working with you as we move forward. And look for, we'll be with Anthony Suggs here in the Bishop's office, and Mike will be out, and we'll do some evening seminar series here and around the community on congregational asset mapping, practices of radical hospitality, and building the bridge to community. So look for those. Encourage you to participate in Colorado Gives Day coming up on the 4th of December, and we can share with you how to do that more. And just to save the date for a stewardship conference coming up on January 26th, and we'll share more about that. So again, thanks, Mike, for being
here. Well, I'm happy to be here.
And we'll blessings and go out in the community and spread the light of the gospel.